everyone, and welcome to this deep dive all about salt. We're diving deep into salt because we know you're curious about it and how it can affect our bodies. We've got some fascinating articles that we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah.
And by the end of this deep dive, you'll be a total salt pro.
Oh, wow.
You'll understand the impact it has on your health, you'll know how much is too much, and you'll have some practical tips to manage your intake. So,
Sounds good.
get this. Did you know that Americans eat more than double the recommended daily sodium intake?
Wow.
That's like sprinkling an extra teaspoon of trouble on your food every day.
Yeah. It's interesting how salt is something that we use every day, but we don't always think much about
It really is.
the impact it can have on our health.
Yeah, and we often use the terms salt and sodium interchangeably, but they aren't quite the same thing, right?
Right, yeah. Sodium is actually a mineral that's just one part of salt. Salt is also known as sodium chloride.
So when we talk about those health effects, we're really focusing on the sodium part.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so
And sodium is actually super important for our bodies to function properly.
so it's not the villain. Why do we need sodium?
Well, think about everything that your body does in a day. Sodium plays a vital role in muscle contractions, nerve signals, and even keeping you hydrated.
Wow, it's doing a lot. So it's not the villain in the story after all?
No.
But I guess the problem is that we're just getting way more than our bodies actually need.
Exactly. We only need about 500 milligrams of sodium per day,
Okay.
and that's something that our kidneys can handle just fine. The problem is the average American consumes a whopping 3,400 milligrams daily,
Okay.
which is over 50% more than the recommended limit.
Okay, so that's over 6 times what we actually need, so no wonder it can cause problems. But where is all this extra sodium coming from?
Well, the biggest culprit is processed and packaged foods. They account for over 70% of our sodium intake.
Oh, wow.
So think convenience meals, frozen dinners, canned soups, and all those tempting snacks.
That makes sense because those foods are designed for convenience and often rely on sodium for flavor and also preservation, I would think.
Exactly.
Right.
You're right. But it's not just the obvious offenders. Even everyday staples like bread, pizza, sandwiches, and cold cuts contribute to our sodium intake. It's amazing how much sodium can be hiding in plain sight.
And what about restaurant meals? Are they also high in sodium?
Yeah.
I'm thinking especially fast food.
You hit the nail on the head. Restaurant meals, especially fast food, are notorious for their high sodium content.
Okay, so
Huh.
basically, whether we're cooking at home or grabbing a quick bite, we're surrounded by sodium. But what happens to our bodies when we overload on all of this salt? Does it just make us feel a little puffy, or is there something more serious going on?
Well, there are definitely some immediate effects that you might notice,
Yeah.
and uncomfortable effects. After a particularly salty meal, have you ever felt bloated and thirsty after eating a bag of chips? Or a salty takeout meal?
Oh, totally. Especially after a night out.
Yeah, well, that's your body reacting to the excess sodium. It's trying to dilute the sodium by holding onto water, which leads to that bloating, especially in your hands, feet, and face.
So that's the culprit behind the puffy eyes and the tight rings.
Mhm.
And the thirst is our body telling us to drink more water to flush out all that extra sodium.
Exactly.
Okay.
But that excess sodium can also lead to headaches, make you feel sluggish, and even interfere with your sleep.
So it's more than just a matter of feeling uncomfortable. Too much sodium can really mess with our body's daily functions.
Absolutely. And those immediate effects are just the tip of the iceberg. The real concern lies in the long-term health risks associated with a high sodium diet.
Okay, let's dive into those risks. What are we talking about here?
One of the most significant concerns is the impact on blood pressure. When you eat a lot of salt, it disrupts the balance of fluids in your bloodstream.
So more fluid in the blood vessels means more pressure pushing against the walls of those vessels.
Exactly. Imagine your blood vessels as a network of highways. When you consume too much sodium, it's like adding more and more cars to those highways. It creates congestion and increases pressure.
So high sodium intake can lead to high blood pressure, or hypertension, as it's medically known. And I know that high blood pressure is a major risk factor for other serious health problems.
Right. High blood pressure puts a tremendous strain on your heart and your entire cardiovascular system,
Oh, wow.
and it significantly increases the risk of heart disease and stroke.
So that extra sprinkle of salt isn't just about taste, it's potentially putting our long-term health at risk. What other long-term risks are associated with a high salt diet?
Well, besides cardiovascular disease, excessive sodium intake has been linked to an increased risk of kidney disease, kidney stones, osteoporosis, stomach cancer, and an even greater risk of stroke beyond what we've already discussed.
Wow, that's a pretty long list. It really highlights how important it is to pay attention to our sodium intake.
It does. But the good news is, by making some simple changes to our diets and lifestyles, we can significantly reduce our sodium intake and lower our risk of these health problems.
That is reassuring to hear. But before we get to those tips, are there any signs that someone might be consuming too much sodium? What should people be looking out for?
Yeah, there are definitely some telltale signs that your body might be struggling with excessive sodium. Persistent thirst and frequent urination are common indicators.
Makes sense. Our body is trying to flush out that extra sodium any way it can. What else?
You might also notice bloating, especially in your hands, feet, or ankles. And pay attention to any unexplained weight gain. While water retention doesn't directly cause weight gain, it can make you feel heavier and contribute to that feeling of puffiness.
So keep an eye on those rings feeling a little tight. It might not just be that extra slice of cake.
Exactly. Another sign is darkened, thicker, and more pungent urine. This happens because your kidneys are working overtime to filter out the excess sodium.
Okay, so we've covered the signs that someone might be overdoing it on salt. Now let's shift gears and talk about what we can actually do to reduce our sodium intake. What are some practical tips that our listeners can start using today?
One of the easiest and most effective ways is to become a label detective. Start reading food labels carefully. Pay close attention to the sodium content per serving and aim for products with less than 140 milligrams per serving.
That makes sense. And I guess you have to be mindful of those serving sizes too. It's easy to eat more than you realize, especially with snacks.
Absolutely. Another game changer is prioritizing whole, fresh, unprocessed foods as much as possible. Fruits, veggies, lean proteins, whole grains, they're naturally lower in sodium compared to their processed counterparts.
So it's all about getting back to the basics. Load up on those real whole foods and you're already on the right track.
Exactly. And even when you do use canned vegetables, go for low sodium varieties. You'd be surprised how much sodium can be lurking in regular canned goods.
I bet. Speaking of flavor, many people think cutting back on salt will just make their food bland. What are some ways to boost flavor without relying on all that sodium?
This is where you can get creative in the kitchen. Experiment with fresh herbs, spices, lemon juice, and vinegars to add flavor and complexity. Think garlic, ginger, paprika, cilantro, dill. There's so many possibilities.
I love using fresh herbs and spices. They add so much depth and interest to dishes. It's like discovering a whole new world of flavor.
It really is. And don't be afraid to experiment with different combinations. You might discover some new favorites in the process.
It's like a culinary adventure. Now, what about those sodium landmines we need to be extra careful of? Are there any foods we should be especially wary of?
Absolutely. Like we talked about earlier, those frozen meals, canned soups, snack items can be really high in sodium. It's amazing how much sodium can be hiding in these seemingly convenient options.
Yeah, I think those sneaky sodium sources are where a lot of people slip up. It's easy to underestimate how much is in those prepared foods.
It's true. Another helpful tip is to spread your sodium intake evenly across your meals. This helps prevent overwhelming your kidneys and gives your body a chance to regulate fluid balance throughout the day.
So don't save up your entire sodium allowance for that one big dinner.
Exactly. And when dining out, don't hesitate to request that your meal be prepared without added salt. Most restaurants are happy to accommodate those requests.
I think people are sometimes afraid to ask, but it's definitely worth it for your health. Knowledge is power.
Now, what about protein choices? Are there better options when it comes to sodium content?
Absolutely. Choosing fresh meats over processed or cured varieties is a good strategy. Processed meats like deli meats and sausages tend to be much higher in sodium.
So opt for that grilled chicken breast or salmon fillet instead of those salty cold cuts.
Exactly. And when it comes to veggies, reach for those fresh or fresh frozen options without added seasonings or sauces.
These are such great tips. By using these simple strategies, we can really make a difference in our sodium intake without having to give up on flavor or convenience. Exactly. Small changes can have a big impact. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to address a common misconception. Reducing sodium intake isn't about deprivation.
I agree. It's not about taking all the joy out of eating.
It's about making healthier choices that support our overall well-being. It's about finding that balance between enjoying flavorful food and taking care of our health.
Right. It's about making conscious choices that align with our health goals.
And sometimes it's those small, consistent changes that make the biggest difference.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from understanding the science behind salt and sodium to uncovering those hidden sources and empowering ourselves with practical tips. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for this everyday ingredient.
Me too. And remember, knowledge is power. Now you have the tools to make informed choices about your sodium intake.
Absolutely. But before we sign off, I have one final question. We've been talking about reducing sodium, but are there any situations where someone might actually need to increase their sodium intake?
That's a great question. And yes, there are certain instances where increasing sodium might be necessary. For example, athletes who lose a lot of sodium through sweat during intense training or competition might need to replenish their levels to prevent electrolyte imbalances.
That makes sense. You lose electrolytes through sweat, and sodium is one of the key electrolytes our bodies need. What other situations might warrant increasing sodium intake?
In some medical conditions, like Addison's disease, where the body doesn't produce enough aldosterone, a hormone that regulates sodium and potassium levels, individuals might need to increase their sodium intake.
So it's not always as simple as just cutting back on sodium. There are nuances to consider, especially if you have any underlying health conditions. It's always a good idea to consult with your doctor or a registered dietitian to determine what's right for you.
Absolutely. They can help you find that sweet spot,
Yeah.
the right amount of sodium to support your body's needs, without putting your health at risk.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I'm definitely going to be much more mindful of my sodium intake from now on.
That's great to hear. Remember, it's not about being perfect, but about making those gradual, sustainable changes you can stick with.
Progress over perfection. I love that. Now, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that salt, or rather the sodium in it, isn't inherently bad. It's all about balance and finding that sweet spot for your individual needs.
Yeah, I love that. Finding that sweet spot where we can enjoy flavorful food, but also take care of our health. It's not about extremes, it's about making those mindful choices.
Exactly. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, remember that even small changes can have a big impact. Start by focusing on one area where you can reduce your sodium intake and gradually build from there.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's about those small, sustainable changes that we can incorporate into our daily lives. Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about the negative effects of too much sodium, but are there any positive sides to salt? Does it offer any benefits beyond just taste?
Well, salt plays a crucial role in preserving food, which has been essential throughout history. It helps inhibit the growth of bacteria and spoilage, allowing us to store food for longer periods.
That makes sense. Especially before refrigeration was widely available, salt was a key player in keeping food safe and edible.
Absolutely. And in certain industries, salt has important applications beyond the culinary world. It's used in manufacturing, agriculture, and even medicine.
That's fascinating. So salt really is a multifaceted ingredient with a rich history and diverse applications.
It really is. And I think it's important to appreciate the role it plays in our lives, both from a practical and a cultural perspective.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been so eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of salt. From its essential functions in our bodies to its impact on our health and its wider role in society.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, knowledge is power. Now you have the information you need to make informed choices about your sodium intake and appreciate the complex role of salt in our world.
Absolutely. And I hope our listeners feel empowered to make those healthier choices, explore new flavors, and continue to be curious about the world around them.
Well said. Before we sign off, I'd like to leave everyone with a final thought-provoking question. If you could cut back on sodium in just one area of your diet, what would it be? And what's one new flavor you could explore as a healthy alternative?
Ooh, that's a great challenge for our listeners. I know I'm already brainstorming some ideas. Maybe I'll finally try making my own spice blends to add more flavor to my meals without relying on salt.
That's a fantastic idea. There are so many creative possibilities out there. It's all about exploring and having fun in the kitchen.
Exactly. Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the salty world. We hope you found this exploration informative, engaging, and empowering.
Thanks for joining us. Keep those curious minds engaged, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.